The horse's breath came in white plumes against the dark. I had ridden out before the hall stirred, before my steward could find me with the morning's dispatches, before any man of my council could place himself between me and the road north. 11 years had passed since the night they took her. 11 years since I had stood in chains in Lord Cassvan's great hall and heard a cart creak through the gate, and looked up through a cracked eye socket to catch one last glimpse of gray wool disappearing into the dark. 11 years since I had sworn, to no one, to the cold air, to whatever power stitched the fated bond into men's chests without asking permission, that I would find her. I was not the same man they had chained. Vornholt's crown sat on a shelf in my chamber. I rarely wore it. The iron forests and the frozen river passes of the north did not require ceremony. They required a king who could ride, who remembered cold, who had slept on stone in a border hold with nothing but a guard's cloak and the memory of a woman's voice to keep him from despair. I was that king. I had become him on purpose, one winter at a time, so that when I arrived at her door I would arrive as something worth returning to. My wolf was quiet beneath my ribs in the way a banked fire is quiet, not extinguished, never that, just held. The road north from Vornholt's capital ran through the iron forest for 2 days before it met the border settlements. Clusters of stone houses pressed against the tree line, smoke rising thin in the gray morning, herb gardens wrapped in rough fencing against the deer. I had sent no word ahead. I had learned in the years since Cassvan's trap that sending word ahead gave men time to prepare lies. I preferred to arrive as I had learned to ride, sudden, quiet, and already there before anyone expected it. My escort of 6 rode at a respectful distance behind me. They knew better than to speak. They had watched me ride this road twice in the last 3 years, once to the Aldrath settlement, once to the village of Corinvane, and returned both times with nothing but a tighter jaw and a longer silence. They were loyal men. They did not ask questions I could not yet answer. She had been married to a lord of the Fenwick border clan. I had known that for 7 years. It had taken 4 to find even that much, because Cassvan had been careful and her family had been frightened, and frightened people leave little trace. The lord's name had been Bren. He had died of a lung fever 3 winters ago. I had learned of his death 6 months later, from a border merchant who had passed through the village of Morthane on the eastern edge of the Vornholt iron forest, and I had felt, not relief, which would have been wrong, because a man I had never met was dead, something more like a lock turning. A door that had been sealed for 7 years shifting on its hinge. I had not ridden immediately. I had waited. I had asked myself, in the long, honest way that men of 40 must ask themselves things, whether I was riding to return something to her or to take something for myself. The answer had taken 3 months, and an uncomfortable conversation with my wolf, who had no patience for philosophical delays, and had spent most of those 3 months sitting at the back of my mind like a hound at a closed door. She is yours, my wolf had said, in the way wolves say things, not in words, but in a certainty that settles into the blood. You don't know that, I had told it. We were 17, we spoke 6 times, I held her hand twice. 6 times, my wolf had replied, and you remember every word. I had not answered that because it was true. I remembered every word. The first time I saw Myra, she had been carrying a basket of dried fennel root through the lower courtyard of her father's settlement house, and she had stopped to watch me train with the border garrison, not with the fascination that some girls brought to watching young soldiers, but with the calm attention of someone cataloging something useful, as if she were studying the way I held my shoulder under the practice sword and noting whether I'd torn the muscle. Her father was a healer. I found out later that she had grown up reading injury the way other children read weather. She had met my eye when I looked up, and she had not looked away first. I was a pack commander's 2nd son. Her father, Healer Durath, was well regarded on the border, not wealthy, but respected. Cassvan's men already watched him, though I did not know that yet. Her mother had died when Myra was small. She and her father lived simply and asked for very little, which was a kind of dignity I recognized and had no word for at 17. We spoke 6 times across the winter I was stationed at the Morthane garrison. 3 conversations in the courtyard when I came to her father for a poultice for my shoulder. She was precise and efficient, and did not soften her assessments to spare my pride, which I found I liked enormously. Once at the winter market, where she corrected a merchant's claim about a dried herb with the mild certainty of someone who had grown up correct and had never felt the need to make noise about it. Once at the garrison's solstice fire, where she stood at the edge of the warmth with a cup of spiced cider and told me that she had never much liked the way pack ceremonies turned cold nights into performances. I had laughed at that, genuinely, not the performed laugh of a young man trying to impress, and she had smiled at her cup. The sixth time was the night before I was transferred north, when I found her in her father's herb garden in the dark, checking on something she had planted under woven straw to protect it from the frost. I had not planned to say anything. I was on my way to the garrison gate to arrange the morning's departure. But I had stopped at the garden fence without deciding to, and she had straightened from the straw bed and looked at me across the dark, and I had said, "I remember this with the precision of something carved. I don't know how to say what I want to say." And she had said, "I know, I don't either." And then she'd gone back inside, and I had stood at the fence for a long time in the cold, feeling something behind my sternum that I had no name for yet. A warmth, very quiet, like an ember that had always been there and had only now been noticed. I had told myself I would come back in spring. I did not come back in spring. What Casvin's trap looked like from the inside was this: a message from the garrison commander summoning me to the Border Lord's Hall for a review of the season's patrol assignments. A locked storeroom where I was told to wait. Two of Casvin's men with ledgers showing pack silver transferred under my name and seal, a seal that Casvin had obtained through means I still do not fully understand and do not think about, because understanding it changes nothing. A third man with a witness account claiming he had seen me accept payment from a rival pack lord for information about the northern passes. I was 20 years old and the son of a dead pack commander who had no allies left. I had no one to call on. The garrison commander who could have testified for me had been transferred 3 months earlier. The investigation lasted 4 days, which was long enough to find me guilty and short enough to prevent me from finding anything that contradicted the charges. I spent 18 months in Casvin's holding cells. I spent them doing 3 things: exercising every morning so that my body remained functional, reading every scrap of paper that passed through the cell in whatever form I could obtain, and not going mad. The day they released me, on a reduced sentence following the death of the garrison commander who had signed my original orders, a death that was convenient enough that I have always doubted it was natural. I walked out of the holding facility and stood in a gray morning much like this one and asked the cold air what was left. Myra was gone. I had known that within the first week. One of the guards had told me, not cruelly, as a fact, the way men in those positions share news with prisoners because there is nothing else to share. Healer Durath had moved his household. The girl had been promised to a border lord to the east. Casvin had made it worth Durath's compliance. The healer was not a coward. He was a frightened man with 1 child left and no protectors, and I have never blamed him. I had sat with that for several years before I stopped blaming him. I walked out of Casvin's cells, and I began, 1 step at a time, to rebuild. What a disgraced pack commander's second son can become, given enough time and enough cold and enough iron purpose, is apparently a king. I did not set out for that specifically. I set out to survive, and then to recover my name, and then to find Casvin's trap in the records and expose it. The last part took 4 years and 2 alliances with border lords who had their own reasons to want Casvin diminished. By the time his seal and the forged transfer documents were formally set before the Northern Pack Council and his holdings were stripped to a provisional stewardship, I had become, by a series of events that I compress here because the story of how I became king is a different story from the one that matters, the man the North needed. The Pack Council named me. I did not campaign for it. I accepted because someone had to, and because I was, by then, capable. I was 37 when they set the crown on a shelf in my chamber. My wolf was 37 winters old, and had never once turned toward another woman. My council found this troubling. They brought me candidates with the regularity of men who believe that political problems can be solved by procurement. They were not wrong about the political problem. Vornholt needed a queen, an heir, a stable succession, and I told them so. I told them I would take a queen when I had found the woman I was looking for. And when they asked me who I was looking for, I told them the truth. A healer's daughter from the Morthane settlement who had corrected a merchant at a winter market and stood at the edge of a solstice fire with a cup of spiced cider, and said she had never liked the way pack ceremonies turned cold nights into performances. My steward, who had been with me for 8 years and had survived worse than my silences, had written down the description without comment. It had taken 2 more years to find her. The village of Morthane itself had not been where she stayed. Her father had died 4 winters after the dispersal. I had found his name in the border healer registry, a quiet entry, a date and a location, nothing more. Myra had continued his practice alone for a year and then accepted a position as a household healer for the Fenwick border clan, which was how she had come to Lord Bren. I did not know whether the marriage had been willing or arranged or some territory in between. I had decided it was not my place to have feelings about it until I knew, and I had held to that with the discipline of a man who has learned that feelings held before they have ground to stand on do nobody any good. What I knew was, Lord Bren was dead. Myra was somewhere in the eastern border settlements. A merchant from Morthane had seen her in the village of Stell Crossing 6 months ago, buying dried rosehip at the autumn market, and she had been alone and had spoken of having a small house near the river. Stell Crossing was where I was riding. The iron forest thinned 2 miles before the river. The trees here were smaller, the irondark bark giving way to birch and alder, and the road softened from packed stone to earth that held the horses' prints. I had ridden this stretch twice before, chasing different leads, and the familiar disappointment of those returns lived in my body as a kind of muscle memory. I did not allow myself to feel certain. I was 40, not 17. I had learned at considerable cost the difference between hope and certainty, and I was not willing to mistake the first for the second again. And then, Stell Crossing was still a mile ahead, around the river bend, when the wind shifted. I am not a man given to describing the fated bond in theatrical terms. I have heard men speak of it as lightning, as thunder, as a sound like bells. What it was for me on that road was this: a warmth behind the sternum that I had not felt in 23 years, not once suddenly present, not exploding, not dramatic, just there, as if it had always been a banked ember and something had breathed on it. My horse slowed without my asking it to. My wolf, which had been quiet for 11 years in the particular way of something that has decided to be patient, went very still in a different way. Not the stillness of waiting, the stillness of arrival. I knew. I sat on the road in the thinning birch and I breathed once carefully and I asked myself, "Are you certain?" My wolf did not even dignify that with a response. I was certain. The house was where the merchant had said, down a track off the river road, behind a slope of winter-bare elder bushes, a stone house with a low roof and a neat herb garden wrapped in the same kind of rough fencing I remembered from her father's courtyard 23 years ago. Smoke came from the chimney. The door was plain wood, painted the faded blue-green of old river moss. I dismounted and told my escort to wait on the road. My captain, Seville, looked at me with the expression of a man who has learned to say nothing when his king gives orders in a particular voice. He nodded and held back. I walked down the track alone. The garden gate was latched but not locked. I stood at it for a moment. The morning was full quiet, no wind now, just the sound of the river somewhere beyond the tree line and the small sounds of a household not yet fully awake. A bundle of dried rosemary hung on the gatepost. Beside it, a small clay weight in the shape of a running wolf, the kind of thing that border settlers made to mark a healer's house. I opened the gate. I had walked 4 steps up the path when the door opened. She stopped on the threshold. 23 years. I had been 20, she had been 17. I was now a gray-templed king of the northern pack in a travel-worn cloak, and she was a woman who had outlasted everything they had done to both of us and stood in her own doorway with the composure of someone who had decided, long ago, that she would not be broken by what she could not control. She looked at me. I looked at her. She said, "I knew the name they gave you when they cleared it." Her voice was the same, quieter than I remembered, quieter in the way that years of living alone make a voice quiet, economical, stripped of excess, but the same. "I followed it," she said. "In the border records, every decision the Northern Council made, I know when you became king." "How long have you known?" I asked. She thought about that for a moment, which was a very Myra thing to do. She had always thought before she answered, and I had always found it the most striking habit in the world. 3 years, she said, since you took the crown. Did you think I would come? The question came out more honest than I intended, but I found I did not want to take it back. She looked at me for a long time. Her eyes were the same color they had been, the warm brown of river stone in sunlight, which I had not thought of in 23 years, but remembered the moment I saw them. "I thought," she said carefully, "that you might have too much ahead of you to look back." I never stopped looking, I said. I want you to know that. Whatever happens now, whatever you decide, I never stopped looking. She was quiet. The warmth behind my sternum was very steady, very certain, the way a river is certain of its direction, not forcing anything, just present. Come in, she said. I'll make tea. Her house was small and ordered in the way that careful people make small spaces. Nothing wasted, nothing ornamental, every shelf with a purpose. Bundles of dried herbs hung from the ceiling beams. A work table with a mortar and several clay jars. A hearth with 2 chairs beside it, the kind of chairs that someone who lives alone acquires one at a time. She put water on the fire and brought down a clay teapot and a tin of dried rosehip and rowan berry. And she moved with the efficiency of someone who has learned that small tasks done carefully are a kind of steadiness when everything else is uncertain. I sat in one of the chairs because standing would have been too much of me in her small space, and she had let me in and I did not want to crowd it. She sat in the other chair while the water heated and she said, without preamble, "They told me you had taken the silver yourself." I know. My father believed it. He didn't want to, but he had seen the ledgers. Casvin showed him the ledgers personally with your seal on them. My father was not a suspicious man. She said this without apology, but also without accusation. As a fact, simply the way she had always spoken. He thought the kindest thing he could do was move me before I understood what had happened. He thought I was too young to survive. She paused, choosing the word carefully. Surviving what happened to you. He was trying to protect you. I know that. I have always known that. She folded her hands in her lap. They were a healer's hands, capable, a little roughened, ink on one finger from whatever she had been writing before I came. He died believing you had taken the silver. I never told him the truth because he died before the council cleared your name. She looked at the fire. I don't know if he would have regretted what he did if he'd known. I think he would have, I said. I think any man who moves his daughter to safety would regret it if the reason turned out to be false. She was quiet for a moment. Then, Lord Bren was not cruel. I had not asked. I was glad she told me. Good, I said. He was distant and he was often ill, even before the fever that took him. I think we were what 2 people can be when neither of them chose the other and both of them are too dignified to make the other suffer for it. Courteous. Even warm sometimes in the way that 2 people can be warm when they share a household in a cold climate. She said this plainly, without performance. I am not grieving him in the way I might grieve a great love, but I am not glad he died. I wouldn't expect you to be. No, she said. I didn't think you would. She looked at me then directly, and I held very still under it. What are you here for, Aldrin? My name in her mouth. She had said it once before in the herb garden 23 years ago. The memory of it and the reality of it now pressed together into something I had no good word for. I'm here because my wolf has not turned toward another woman in 23 years, I said. And because I have spent 11 of those years looking for you specifically, and now I have found you, and I believe, that what I felt when we were young and did not have words for was the fated bond. And I think you know it too, or you would have asked me to leave before you put the water on. She looked at the fire for a long time. I would have asked you to leave, she said quietly, if I thought there was anything I could do about it. Can't you? She looked at me. The corner of her mouth moved, not quite a smile yet, but the precursor to one, the same expression she'd had at the solstice fire all those years ago. I spent 11 years telling myself I couldn't. Every time I heard your name in the border records, I told myself it was only curiosity, respect for a man who had been wronged and had rebuilt himself. I told myself that whatever I had felt at 17 was simply what girls feel at 17, which is very strong and means very little in the long run. And did you believe yourself? Not particularly, she said. No. The water was boiling. She got up and made the tea with the efficiency of long habit. The rosehip and rowan steeped in the clay pot, poured into 2 plain cups, not sweet, the way northern border people take it. She set 1 cup in front of me and settled back into her chair with the other, and she held it in both hands, and the steam rose between us, and for a moment neither of us spoke. I said, I need to tell you something about Lord Casvin. She looked up. He is still alive. He was stripped of his border holding 4 years ago when the forged documents came before the council, and he has been under provisional stewardship since then. The council has been diplomatic about the degree of his culpability, because he has family in 3 of the border clans, and reopening the full case was considered destabilizing. I paused. I have been patient about this because I was learning the North and I needed those clans' cooperation. I am done being patient. I came north because I needed to find you, and because when I return to Vornholt, I intend to bring Casvin's full account before the council and have it settled properly. Your father's name and yours have been associated by the border records with his manipulation. That should be corrected. She was very still. Your family's land, the Morthane settlement where your father practiced, was absorbed into Casvin's holdings after the dispersal. If the council rules as I expect, it should be returnable. There is no one to return it to now except you. I met her eyes. I thought you should know that before you decided anything. She said, you came here to tell me that. I came here, I said, because of the bond. I'm telling you about Casvin because you deserve to know what is coming and to have a voice in how it is handled, and because the healer who raised you deserved better than what Casvin did to him. These are separate things. I looked at my cup. They may also not be entirely separate things. I'm not certain they are. She was quiet for a long time. Then she said, 23 years ago in my father's herb garden, you said you didn't know how to say what you wanted to say. I remembered. I knew what it was, she said. I knew what I felt and I thought I knew what you felt, and I told myself, we are 17 and he is being transferred north in the morning and there will be time. I thought there would be time. Her voice was very steady, the way voices are when the steadiness is being maintained rather than naturally held. And then there wasn't. There is now, I said. She looked at me, not the careful, cataloging look of a healer reading injury, something else. Something that had been held back for a long time and was beginning, very slowly, to be set down. I am 40 years old, she said. I am a healer's widow in a small house by a river. I have gray at my temple and ink on my hands, and I have not been to Vornholt since I was a child. I know. You are a king. I know that too. Those are not, she paused, those are not small differences. No, I agreed, they are not, and I am not asking you to overlook them or pretend they are small. I am asking you to consider whether, given everything we have both survived, you think the bond between us is something worth following into whatever shape it takes next. I held her gaze. I am not asking you to do anything you don't choose. I want you to know that clearly. If you ask me to leave, I will leave, and Casvin's reckoning will still happen because it is the right thing to do. This is not a negotiation. It is a question. She looked at me for a long moment with those river-stone eyes. My father, she said slowly, used to say that the fated bond is not given to make things easy. It is given to mark where you are supposed to go, and then it leaves the going to you. He sounds like a wise man. He was a frightened one sometimes, but yes, she looked at her tea. He would have wanted, I think, if he had known the truth of it, if he had lived to know, he would have wanted me to go where the bond points. She was quiet. It has been pointing at you, she said softly, for a very long time. I set down my cup. I said, then come home. She needed 2 days to settle her affairs, the herb garden handed to a neighbor's daughter who had been learning from her, the house and its contents arranged, a letter sent to the Fenwick clan's steward. She moved with the unhurried certainty of someone who has learned not to mistake urgency for importance, and I spent those 2 days in Stell Crossing with my escort camped at the river bend, and I was not impatient. I had waited 23 years. I could wait 2 days. On the morning of the 3rd day, she came to the river road with a single pack and the clay wolf weight from her gatepost, which she held in her hand for a moment before placing it in the top of the pack, with the deliberateness of someone taking a talisman. My Captain Seville looked at me and then at her and said nothing, which was the right response. I put her on the horse behind me because the escort horses were not suited to passengers, and because my wolf had been patient for 23 years and had reached the limit of its patience for physical distance. She settled behind me with the practicality of a woman who has ridden northern roads before, and she put her hands at my sides in the matter-of-fact way of someone holding on for balance, and the warmth behind my sternum steadied into something I had not felt in 23 years. Simply, quietly, the certainty of the right direction. We rode south through the iron forest. She asked me about Vornholt, the hold, the council, the politics, the pack structure, with the focused attention of someone who intends to understand a thing properly before she enters it. She asked good questions. I had always known she would. I answered them honestly, including the uncomfortable parts. The council's nervousness about my unmarried state, the clan politics that had kept Casvin's full account from being settled, the difficulty of ruling a northern kingdom when 3 of the border lords still remembered me as a disgraced pack commander's second son. "They will say," she said when I had finished, "that you married a border widow with no standing and no pack. Some of them will. What will you say?" I thought about it. "I will say that she is the Alpha King's fated mate, and the daughter of the finest healer the Morthane border ever produced, and that any man who has standing to question her worth is welcome to state his question where the pack can hear it." I paused. "I will probably not say it that calmly." She laughed, brief and quiet. I felt it against my back. It was the first time I had heard her laugh in 23 years. My wolf was very satisfied with itself. We arrived at Vornholt's capital on the 5th day. I had sent a rider ahead on the 2nd, not to announce her precisely, but to have the eastern wing of the king's hold opened and warmed, and to summon the council for the morning following our arrival. The hold was gray stone and iron-dark timber, the kind of building that does not try to be impressive and is therefore more impressive than buildings that do. I watched Myra look at it from the road with the assessing gaze of a healer studying a patient, reading the bones of it, the proportions, the way the smoke rose from the hall chimneys in the cold morning air. "It's a good hold," she said. "I find it suits me," I said. She nodded, as if this confirmed something she had already suspected. The steward met us in the courtyard. He looked at Myra with the expression of a man who has waited 3 years to see this particular moment arrive and does not wish to say so. He welcomed her with the formal phrase for a king's honored guest, which was technically correct and technically insufficient, and I let it stand for the moment because there would be a proper form for the rest of it, and I intended to observe it. I showed her to the eastern wing myself. The fire was burning. There were dried flowers in a clay jar on the windowsill, because someone on my household staff had apparently decided that this was what was appropriate for a woman's arriving, and I made a note to thank whoever it was. She stood at the window and looked out at the iron forest to the north, the tree line visible from the eastern wing in a long, dark band under the pale winter sky. She was quiet for a moment. "I can see the road we came in on," she said. "You can see it for a long way from this window. On clear days, you can see the first of the border passes." She looked at the forest for another moment. Then she turned and looked at me. "This is real," she said, "not a question, a settling." "It is." She nodded again, then she said, "I'm going to need a work table for the herbs." "I'll have one made. And I would like to see your hold's current healer at some point, not to replace, just to understand what's in place." "I'll arrange it. And I want to be in the room when you present Casvin's account to the council. I won't speak unless asked, but I want to be in the room." "You'll be in the room," I said, "and you can speak if you want to. You are not a witness. You are a woman who was directly harmed by what he did, and the council should hear that." She considered this. "All right," she said. The council session was the following morning. I had convened it without specific agenda given, northern account, full council, attendance required, and they came with the brisk unease of men who know something large is coming and do not know its shape. 8 of them, representing the major pack territories of the north. 3 who had been on the council that cleared my name 8 years ago. 2 who still, I was reasonably certain, had lingering doubts about the full nature of Casvin's involvement. Myra sat to my left. I had told the steward to place a chair beside mine, not at the far end of the table, and the council's noticing of this was visible in the particular stillness that men produce when they are trying not to visibly notice something. I laid the full account before them. Not the reduced version. The complete record. The original forgery of my seal, which had been established by 4 document examiners 8 years ago. The pattern of transfers that preceded it, traced to Casvin's agent rather than any action of mine. The testimony of Healer Durath, recorded by the border registry before his death. A formal statement he had made 2 years after the dispersal, when enough time had passed for his fear to give way to clarity, stating that he had been shown documents by Casvin personally, and been told explicitly that complying with the marriage arrangement would ensure his family's safety. That last document was new. I had found it 6 months ago. I had been waiting to use it correctly. There was a long silence when I finished. Councillor Worth, oldest of the 8, driest, not a man given to readable expression, said, "You are asking the council to move from the provisional stewardship to a full accounting." "I am," I said, "with sanctions appropriate to a deliberate fraud that resulted in the wrongful detention of a pack commander, the dispersal of a healer's household, and the coerced removal of a woman from the man she was fated to mate with." I let that last phrase sit on the table for a moment. "Among other consequences." Worth looked at Myra, not unkindly, assessing. He was a man who assessed before he spoke, which was why I respected him even when he was difficult. Myra met his assessment with composure. She said, "My father made a statement before he died. You have it in front of you." He was not a man who lied, and he was not a man who made formal statements lightly. He made that one because he wanted the record to be correct, even though he was dying and it could help no one in practical terms at that point. She paused. "I think the record should be correct." Worth held her gaze for a moment, then he nodded. The vote was 7-1. The dissenting councillor was, predictably, Renwick, who represented the clan that had absorbed Casvin's former territories and had the most to lose from a full reckoning. I noted his position and moved on. Lord Casvin was summoned from his provisional stewardship within the fortnight. The charges were laid before the full border pack court. He was an old man now 71, diminished from the lord who had locked me in a storeroom 40 years ago, and he did not contest the substance. He said only that he had done what the border required, which was perhaps the saddest defense possible, and also, in its way, the most honest thing he had ever said. His remaining holdings were stripped. His stewardship ended. A pension was granted because I am not interested in punishing old men into destitution. I am interested in having the record correct, which is what Healer Durath had wanted and what Myra had asked for. The Morthane settlement lands were formally restored to the Healer registry, with Myra named as the inheriting party in recognition of her father's service. She stood in the courtyard of the hold the afternoon the restoration papers were signed, and looked at them for a long time without speaking. "He would have wanted to know," she said finally. "I think that's all he would have wanted." "I think so too," I said. She folded the papers and put them in the pocket of her gray wool coat, and she looked at the iron forest on the horizon, and she was quiet for a moment in the way that people are quiet when they are letting something settle that has been unsettled for a very long time. We were married in the King's Hall on the last night of the first month of the new year. Not a grand ceremony, not a ceremony designed to be a performance. My council was there, and Seville and the escort who had ridden north with me, and the household staff who had put dried flowers in the eastern wing, and a healer named Torin who had been Vornholt's hold healer for 12 years, and had spent the previous 3 weeks teaching Myra the herb stores and the patient registry and receiving from her. I gathered from his expression considerably more knowledge than he had expected to impart. The pack rites were spoken. I gave her my mark, not a ceremony of grand light and theater, as the bond ceremonies in the South sometimes are, but the northern rite. My hands over hers, the recitation of the old words, and the warmth behind my sternum that I had carried for 23 years finally, fully, naming itself. She held my hands and said the return words in the precise, deliberate voice she used for things that mattered. My wolf was entirely calm. Afterwards there was a simple supper at the long table, good food, plain wine, the hall warm with the fires my steward had built up against the winter cold. Myra sat beside me and spoke with Councillor Worth about the Border Healer Registry and what she thought its gaps were, with the engaged seriousness of a woman who has found her place and intends to make it useful. Worth, who is not a demonstrative man, was visibly attending. I watched her. I had been watching her off and on for 23 years in memory, in the border records, in the faces of women who were not her. Now she was here at my table with a cup of winter tea rather than wine because she had told me cheerfully that she had never liked wine, and her ink-stained hands were wrapped around the cup, and the firelight caught the gray at her temple, and she said something that made Worth almost smile. I thought 23 years, a storeroom and a seal and a frightened healer and a cart creaking through a gate at night, 11 winters of riding north and returning south and starting again, a long cold road to a house with a painted door. And this, her hands around the clay cup, the warmth behind my sternum, now named, now complete, the iron forest dark beyond the hall windows, the sound of Vornholt at peace. My wolf pressed its warmth against my ribs like a banked fire that needed nothing more. I did not reach for any larger thought than that. I had spent 23 years reaching for her. I was content now to have arrived. She set the work table in the east room, where the morning light came in long and gray and good for reading the fine gradations of dried leaf. She organized her herbs by the border naming system her father had used rather than the capital system, and she spent 2 weeks convincing Torin that the northern method was both older and more precise, and Torin eventually conceded with the dignity of a man who knows he is right to concede. I gave her the border healer registry access she had asked for. Within a month, she had identified 3 settlements without resident healers and had begun corresponding with the training school in the southern capital about apprenticeships. I did not suggest this. She simply did it, the way she did most things, without drama, with precision, because it needed doing and she was in a position to do it. My council, who had been nervous about a border widow with no pack standing, were not nervous about her by the end of the first month. They were, if anything, slightly in awe, which I found I enjoyed enormously. She did not become a different person in Vornholt. She remained exactly who she had been in the small house by the river, which was exactly who she had been in her father's herb garden 23 years ago. Calm, direct, competent, carrying a kind of quality that does not need elevation to express itself. She had always been a queen. The title only made visible what had always been there. There is a memory that lives with me from the first winter, which is not a grand memory, and which I have never tried to write down because the act of writing it seems inadequate to what it is. We were in the east room late one afternoon, the kind of afternoon that comes in the northern winter when the light goes flat and silver, and the world outside the windows is very quiet. She was working at her work table, and I was reading at the smaller desk I had put in the corner, which was not strictly efficient, and which my steward had accepted without comment, because my steward is a wise man. She made tea, as she often did in the late afternoon, rosehip and rowan in the clay pot, poured into 2 plain cups, not sweet. She set mine on the corner of the work table without interrupting what I was reading, and she went back to her own work. I looked up from my papers. She had her cup in both hands and was reading something in the healer registry, her brow very slightly drawn in the way it drew when she found something she intended to correct. Her ink-stained hands were wrapped around the clay, and the steam rose in the flat winter light, and the room smelled of dried rosehip and the ironwood smoke from the hearth. 23 years I had carried the memory of her standing in her father's herb garden in the dark, a gray wool coat, the careful way she moved, the sound of her voice saying, "I know, I don't either." I had carried it through a storeroom and 18 months of cells, and the slow, cold work of becoming a king. I had carried it north and south and north again, through every winter that returned without her. And here were her hands, here was the clay cup. Here was the flat silver light, and the smell of her work table, and the quiet of a room where 2 people can sit without speaking, because they have found the place where the carrying ends. I looked at her for a long moment. She did not notice, or she noticed and said nothing, which with Myra amounts to the same grace. I picked up my own cup. I returned to my papers. The fire held, and the room held, and the 23 years folded themselves quietly into the past where they belonged.